Hello everyone, good evening. I'm Susan Kukuchka, the Events Manager here at State Library of Queensland, and I'd just like to begin tonight by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Turrbal people and the Yugara people, and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. So welcome everyone, thank you for coming tonight to the UQ Architecture Lecture, which we hold in conjunction with the University of Queensland. All I'm really here to do is just a little bit of housekeeping. So before we start, can everybody please switch the sound off your mobile phone? If you need to come and go during the lecture, please just do so via the doors on level 3. Bathrooms are on 2 and 3. And also, just so you know, we're recording tonight's talk, which we will have available on the SLQ website. So if you have any questions about that, just come and speak to one of the staff after the talk. And we'll also have some Q&A at the end. So if you want to participate in that, please just put your hands up, wait for the microphone so we can record your questions as well. So thank you all for coming again, and I'd like to hand over to Louis Verducci, Professor of Architectural Design at UQ, to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Good evening. Thanks, Susan. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks once again to the State Library of Queensland for hosting these lectures, in which the UQ School of Architecture aims to engage not only with students and professionals, but also with the general public into the thinking and making of architecture. I'd like to especially thank Kathy Hayter, the Director of Engagement and Partnerships of the State Library of Queensland, and her team for being especially supportive of this event and collaboration. I am particularly happy today to present UQ graduate, architect, and QUT professor Kevin O'Brien, who will be presenting a project for this city. Its title, Finding Country, has somehow already become a catchphrase in the design studio jargon, particularly when discussing large-scale issues on Australian territory. The lecture subtitle, The Idea, suggests that there could be other versions of it, the film, the novel, the musical perhaps. I am particularly happy to hear today's version. For the only other time I heard Kevin speak about it, I think the subtitle must have been The Budget. Jokes aside, it is not easy to put together a provocation like this one. It is certainly not an issue of cost, it is an issue of magnitude. But history has plenty of examples, if scarce, of individual women and men that have dealt with issues of great magnitude. The Asia Pacific Design Library Management hasn't asked me to recommend any number of books, let alone the 5 that it is requested to speakers invited to the lecture series. But since we're in a library, I will explain the magnitude of Kevin O'Brien's project by mentioning the 2 books by which I have been fully absorbed this last year. One, my students will know by now, is The Possibility of an Absolute Architecture by Pier Vittorio Aureli, an extraordinary account of territorial transformations and city making. Aureli presents the work of 5, perhaps 4 or 5 architects of the past in a somewhat contemporary fashion. They all, Aureli describes, share an agenda, a project for the city. They all, Palladio, Piranesi, Boulez, perhaps Mies, and Ungers, are not planners, no chief architects, no urban designers, and surely no architecture corporations. One could say that they are one-man business, writers of treatises, engravers, visionaries, educators, architects, notwithstanding. The second book, The Biggest State on Earth, by Bill Gammage, put me on the track to a completely different understanding of the Australian territory, if I ever had one, and its present and historical management. Gammage's approach to the object of his research is not different from Aureli's. His reading of the territorial accounts of this continent is in the same contemporary fashion, regardless of time or origin, whether explorers, colonizers, or country people. What Aureli and Gammage propose is this idea of magnitude, and I think both titles of the books express it very clearly. Absolute Architecture, the Biggest State on Earth. When I confronted myself Kevin's Finding Country burned mural in Venice last September, I realized that these two views, both on history and the present, could actually be brought together into architecture. Please join me to welcome Kevin O'Brien. Sorry.
Okay. I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Turrbal and Jagera people, and thank you all for coming out tonight. There's 4 parts to this that I want to share with you, and it begins in Venice last year. And the first thing I saw that captured my imagination since is this thing called the Pyrenees Ii Variations. What it's about is, I guess, the folio of drawings that Giovanni Battista Pyrenees did in 1762, and it's based on these etchings that he collected over approximately 40 years of different parts of ruins in ancient Rome. And he used these as the beginnings of a massive drawing on Campo, Marzio. And this is what Mr. Eisenman became very fascinated with and invited P.V. O'Reilly and Mr. Kipnis in to do something called the Pyrenees Ii Variations at last year's Venice Biennale. It was right in the centre of the central pavilion, and it consisted of 4 large models that you can see there. The first is a golden one, which is Pyrenees' version of Rome, where he left the Pantheon in its original place, but then dispersed the rest of the ruins as the beginnings of a fantastical notion of what Rome could be about. What each of the teams did after that was their own sort of premise. So Peter Eisenman had a project going at Yale University, which was called the project of Campo Marzio, and what he was interested in was treating Pyrenees' drawing not as an archaeological thing, but as an architectural experiment. That's interesting because what I didn't say in the original drawing that Pyrenees made of this, or the etching, was that it represented a landmark in the shift during the Enlightenment from a traditional antiquarian view of history to a scientific archaeological one. And I think that's where Finding Country is located. The second team was P.V. O'Reilly's, and he is, I believe, a local of Venice and trained at the university there. There's definitely a Marxist thread in his pursuit of the dialectic. This is the one, though, that hooked me, and I came back to it over the course of a week every day to look at it and try and understand it a bit more. Obviously, it's about walls, but the walls I was interested in were the negative ones, because there's 2 types there, positive and negative, and it was the tension between them that I couldn't help feeling I needed to come back and look at more and more. He did this with a group called Dogma, which I believe is a Belgian-based practice, and this was called A Field of Walls, and it explores how the politics embedded in the etchings are not a function of forms but of walls, and as such provides a guide for contemporary architecture to reconsider the power of relations it deploys. This third one was probably the funniest thing I saw at Venice, and it was by Kipnis and the Ohio State University team. And the explanation was that it reanimates the passions, perversions, and spectacles of ancient Rome as a morality play for contemporary architecture. I think that's best explored in the section. So there's 3 places to be. There's heaven, which is the Corbusian building recently completed. In the middle is the known world, which most of us occupy, and at the bottom, at the end of the river, was hell. And there seemed to be a slap at Dutch architects and their form making in that. The other thing he made clear to me was that it also proved that excrement doesn't run uphill. So, at the end of last year, I did a short talk to master's students at UQ for Lewis. I gave a little overview of that, saying there was something in it I didn't quite understand it and I need to in due course. That brought me to Lewis questioning me around Aurelian, wanting to know more and getting to this book. But once I did get into this book, the possibility of an absolute architecture, became much clearer to me what the purpose of my project would like to aspire to. So what this is now I'm going to show is what I actually did put on last year in Venice, and it was supported primarily by Queensland interests, and a lot of you are in the room tonight. We raised 70,000 in cash and 30,000 in kind to make it happen, and of that, approximately 40,000 went directly into the Venetian economy, never to be seen again. So this is the show. David Hanson from the practice and Tina Tam came across with me to help install and sort of be the custodians of it for the first week or two. We had a fantastic space because it was right beside the old Arsenale wall. We had a view down towards the main place, if you like. But the origin of this project began in 2005 when myself and a collaborator, Michael Markham in Victoria, who's also a mentor of sorts, we decided to put an entry in to direct the Australian Pavilion. And this is the entry we put in. It was a small catalogue, about A5 size. And the argument was very clear. We used an Elizabeth Farrelly line which said mediocrity is how we actually know we're Australian, because it's what we do best. And it was a comment and critique of the Australian presence in Venice for that decade. So we obviously set ourselves up to take a few hits after saying that sort of stuff, but where we got to was the project itself is a mapping exercise, and what we wanted to do was reveal that the Australian city is a Western construct, and you're hard pressed to find any evidence of Aboriginal place within that. So up until about 2000, I always believed that the way into it was by looking at Brisbane or whatever city we're in as a series of vertical layers, if you like, and you scratch through one to get back to some sort of form of original place. But this project overturned that, and it's a horizontal contest between city and country now. So there's only two things at stake here. It's not 8 or 9 or 10. So if you have city, you don't have country. If you have country, you don't have city. So it's the way of taking things away. So the image on the left was simply saying there's a lot of information out there. You can look at it in archaeological terms, or you can look at it in modern terms, but there's enough references to understand or start to develop a sense of what country might be. The original proposition had 8 panels, and we were doing one for each capital in Australia. The agent that we're bringing to bear was this idea of decline. So we wanted people to imagine, in the same way that other cities have reached points of decline, like Rome and Babylon, Pompeii, New Orleans, Mexico City, that if the population decreases, then how would you take away a portion of that city accordingly? And the opportunity, we said, was to find something that's been lost. And the thing that's lost in the Australian city is this idea of country, and it's a very unique thing, I think, to Australia. So the instrument of inquiry was going to be a plan. Each person got a grid from the street directory and had to empty it by 50%. And in doing so, they had to find out exactly what it was they were interested in, articulate their argument, articulate what they thought country was, and the reasons for emptying parts of the city. It involved putting a value judgment across the entire grid and every single line, and what that meant. The aesthetics was something that my team would control. So once we got, I think it was 50 invitations, we had 44 come back in the end. Our team developed the aesthetic as an artistic pursuit. It was simply to make a beautiful drawing. So where it ended up is, you can see here on the right, is that each grid becomes its own essay or its own position. It's not a matter of trying to assemble a new city, because it's not possible. So there is no one plan of a new city. And that's something that came out in the Aureli readings, which I'm still thinking through. What it does do is, when it comes together as a whole, is leaves something recognisable, which is obviously the river. But each of these grids and each of the participants had a very different argument for emptying, and very different sets of values. The graphic itself was very different to a version we did back in 2009, which was black, and we used the colours of your car dashboard, the luminous colours, to be the graphic and the thing that you use to see at night in unseen space. So this one was about X-ray, what you can see when you look through something. So the final drawing came together as an 8 by, well, just under 8 metres and just under 3 metre long drawing, which started behind Mount Cootha and finished out at the other side of Stradbroke Island. And it was enough at that scale to show the difference in this whole argument and the matter of scale, and that in this version, country is the thing forming the city. And as you get inside to each of these grids, it's the other way around. Accompanying the big drawing in Venice was a series of photographs. Sorry, I'll just get a whiskey. Accompanying this drawing was a series of photographs which were used as a primer into the bigger picture of, or into more as a study into the bigger drawing. And what we're getting at in all of these was that there's this presence of two things. There's this radical centre that I'm aiming for. There's two things that appear opposite, but instead of synthesising them, we're just bringing them together in a state of tension. So we're not trying to find a version of grey. It's just these are the two contestants, and this is what happens. So in that way, back in 2009, the one-off I did in Melbourne was a series of skateboards that I decorated and gave to pool skaters to break into abandoned houses and skate the pools, and they had to send the boards back. And it was just a simple idea about someone who owns property and someone who owns space because they occupy it. So it's no different to the seat you're sitting in right now. You don't own it, the library does, but you'd be hard-pressed taking it off you right now. So what's nice, there's a series of these images, and the one that really gained a lot of traction over there was this one, and it was just a typical Queenslander that we're all very familiar with. What a lot of people probably don't realise is that a lot of these timbers came from first growth forests, and in many cases local Aboriginal people would bury elders in the forks of the trees, and they would grow into the tree. So you can imagine when these things are cut down, I could wax on as a symbolic argument about what that means, but what I actually think technically means, what I think is more interesting, is that there are people literally inside the structure. And that's what this image was about. On the night of the opening, I might go a day before we did this, one of the things in the translation of this whole show with the Venetians was that neither myself or David understood Italian, and but we thought numbers were a pretty safe bet, which they turned out not to be. So the space itself was, I think, about 200 or 300 mil lower than they said it was, and the room was about a metre shorter than they said it was. So in the end we had a drawing where we had to stretch canvases, steel timber from the British Pavilion, and then wedge this thing up and very slowly hammer it till we got to this sort of magic point where you could read the drawing on an incline, but it also stiffened the 17th century ceiling above us. So the ceiling was the squarest thing in Venice, from what I could tell. So at the end of the night, on the opening, we decided to burn the drawing, or at least scorch it, which was kind of difficult given the laws against fire in Venice. They'd moved, I think, about a century before, they'd moved the glassworks off because they were a bit uptight about fires. So David found an ingenious way, and it was a can of WD-40 and a lighter, so I managed to scorch this thing. But what it was coming down to, I think, in the moment was, apart from the whole event of Venice, it was also trying to ram home this idea that the grids that hadn't been touched were the ones that would be burnt. And country, to me, in the way Gamage has described it, is something that's a matter of economy. It's something that's managed. It's something he's proven, or at least argues, is managed by fire, which I agree with. So what it isn't is it's not a park. It's not something to be scared of, and it's not wilderness. So, and some schemes argue that, and that's fine, but that's not my position. So I guess another thing lost in translation was that in the way that I would normally do things culturally is that you would ask for an acknowledgement of place and the custodians. We thought we would do this very small kind of exchange on the day with the local Venetian artists that were hosting us. What I didn't realise is that they ordered a jazz band that came and played for 3 hours and sang in the Venetian language. So by the time we got around to sort of saying thank you and welcoming each other, it was well into the evening, and some things were again lost in translation. But the bassist was clearly taking precautions against the fire. So this is the beginning of the event. And I think it's fair to say it was probably a completely loose thing. We didn't quite know what was going to happen and what was going on. We thought it was inside the space, and all of a sudden it took over the square, and it went on and on. What was really nice about this is that it just encapsulated the beginnings of a relationship that wasn't actually about the circus of Venice. It was actually about a connection with these local Venetian artists, and because of that connection and their acknowledgement, different kinds of doors open. So I didn't quite get to see the whole formal nature of the Biennale show, despite us being an official exhibition of that Biennale. But what I did get to see was just about every canal in Venice through the eyes of local Venetians, which was a complete privilege. This is everyone who supported us in every kind of way. So it's also become, I guess, the image that I think separates exactly what certainly I stand for and what the project stands for. I subscribe to a model of patronage, not one of sponsorship, and where that gets difficult is that there's a consequence attached to that, as I've come to learn. But you'll see in our catalogue and everything that we've done online, there's only one logo, and that's the logo of the Biennale, the official presence. And I do that for a reason, is because the content of what we're doing is slightly contentious. And the minute a sponsor and his models and logos are across that, you tend to get censored which I know has happened to other people in the past. So it could never exist in reality through the Australian Pavilion, and the Australian Pavilion in reality could never really host this. They're just not a fit. So they're kind of at either ends of the spectrum. So we became known as the official un-Australian presence last year. So in this third part, what I wanted to show you was some of the projects that our office is doing, which are based or trying to address this idea of finding country. And just give you a sense of where we're going as a practice and what all this posturing is about. I thought there was a nice quote from the O'Reilly text where he says, "Through its act of separation and being separated, architecture reveals at once the essence of the city and the essence of itself as political form, the composition of separate parts." So in this first of three projects I've got here, this is a house in West End. It was designed by myself and Susan and for our family. And the first thing it's trying to connect to is, I guess, the place, the country we're in. It's a really simple move because the thing's obviously Mount Cootha, and Cootha for the Turrbal and Jagera people is it's a place. And we wanted to make a prospect directly towards it and have this sort of sense that there was this cultural entity, if you like, that was visually there. In the house itself, this is the space, and these are the spaces around it. So the consequence of not having windows in this place is that if you want to view it and access to country, you have to go outside to get it. That's the way it goes. So after seeing a number of these kind of programs where you see couples saying they have to compromise to design a house together, I think Sue and I got to a point where we felt like we were going to vomit if we saw it again. I mean, the reality is if you're making a good piece of architecture, you shouldn't compromise at all. So Susan channeled her Irish heritage and I channeled mine, and we decided not to enter into any form of compromise in making our decisions. And it ended up in a really interesting place. Some of it was quite literal, and all of the decisions has a consequence, but they also have some fantastic outcomes that were unexpected. So one of the, I guess, interesting things is that, I mean, it helped us just even determine what was a tradition of material in a literal way. So timber became the thing about me in the north of Queensland, and concrete became the thing about Susan and Europe. And in trying to pursue, I guess, more of this idea of tension and bringing things into the opposite position, everything has an opposite, that's it. So even the artwork by Fiona Foley is floated off a vertical wall of gold, and the motif from my area, from the islands, is depressed into it. So one's expressed, one's depressed. You know, we have square columns versus round columns. There's a lot of these things are quite figurative and literal. But at the centre of this place is a hole, and that's it. And the hole's defined by the sky and light, and that's the thing that pins us to the ground. So in my understanding of country, it's not just a matter of what's underfoot, it's also what's above you, what's around you, what you can see. If you'd like to see it, you can come over. You better ring ahead, sorry. This next project was, it's in a place called Lockhart River, which is right up in the Cape York. It's about an hour and a half rocky Cessna flight from Cairns. We did this in conjunction with Project Services. prior to the state election when there was a project services. So we worked with some really, really great people on this, and all the engineering was with project services people, and project management was brilliant. It was just a really fantastic project, and some of these things just come off in such a way. Even the funding bodies, of which I think there was 7 at federal and state levels, was kind of a juggling act, but at the end they were all quite keen to hear what was the purpose of this project for the community. What it is a retail store and government offices, so it's quite a banal sort of program, but it has a really deep cultural problem attached to it, and it's one of surveillance. So Lockhart River was established, I think, in 1924, and it has 5 traditional owner groups that were pulled into a place that they wouldn't necessarily be together with, I think they were Lutheran missionaries this time. Now, in the making of, or at least in the thinking of this, the conversations with local people were very clear about the way avoidance occurred. So there's 2 types of avoidance. There's one where people just avoid each other for conflictive reasons. And then there's another one which was a little bit deeper, which was to do with avoiding brother-in-laws and sister-in-laws, and it was a bit more of a traditional understanding of why you avoid people. So the big problem with a retail store is that there's one door to go through, and that's the point of security around which everything is controlled. And that's a problem because you can't see who's coming and going. And how it's normally managed in the other communities throughout Australia is that the kids just run in and out and they look around to see who's in there and give the nod and clear to go in. So that's a pretty unique problem. And it's a big problem because then you talk to the guys who run the shop and they're pulling their hair out trying to understand why the kids keep running through the doors and blah, blah, and it all goes on and on. So what we set up was a really simple idea that we would address this before we got in, and we'd probably make, I think, what's considered the first civic space in an Aboriginal community. And that's this thing here that's outlined in the red. So there's 2 marks to it, and there's one where you can sit under a tree and see all the main approaches, and there's a second beside the door where you can see back to the main approach, which I'll show you shortly. The plan itself was pretty basic. During the course of the project over the 2 years, we went from potentially 8 government agencies looking for space down to 4, up to 12, and it kept going up and down. And the way we ended up responding to it was just to say that these little cell-like plans could be inhabited by 1 or by 2s or by 4s, depending on how many people came. But when we actually pressed with the agencies about when they'd actually be in town, it worked out most of them would be there once a month. So they typically didn't really need to have their own space. It was just a management time-sharing issue. So this is the main intervention, if you like, or it's not really even an intervention, it's just a seat. And it's a seat that's big enough to let people face exactly where they need to face. And they approach from where they live and they sit facing towards what they need to see. Interestingly, a previous scheme by an engineering group that I won't mention looked at bulldozing these beautiful beech almond trees. Which I don't know if any of you have been to the tropics, but shade's really comfortable. So I think it's a good thing to keep. The other thing about this is we tried to address, I guess, the harshness of what happens in a lot of these communities where the retail store has, it's just flooded by security lights, and its image is one of defence. It's barbed wire and they're not exactly enticing buildings. So what we're trying to make is a civic space based on the culture of the inhabitants. Behind this big polycarbonate screen of Mimper shields is the flood lighting, which is all the security lighting. And instead of it being this blinding presence and quite a offensive one, it becomes something that just glows at night. That's the second space sitting inside. So there's a number of stages before you actually get around to entering, which just sort of make the whole process a slow thing. And the extroverted nature of the space means it's entirely comfortable until you reach that doorway. So that previous project was about settings for people. This project's in a place called Warrabinda. It's about 2 hours west of Rockhampton. And I mean, Warrabinda is a tough place. There's no other way to describe it. It's got a tough history. It's goes through phases of positive community actions, and then it falls off. But its history is a tortured one. And it was established in 1927, and it collected 17 different language groups from central Queensland and put them into a very, very tough one-road sort of place. So this, in terms of its first urban mark, was a series of grids that were dropped straight across that landscape, and that became a logical method of distribution and control. So the first act, which I'm finding is an impulsive one on my part, is to reject the grid outright, possibly for the wrong reasons, but maybe that'll change. But in this case, the thing I thought was more important than the grid was the cemetery in between, or wrapped by this lagoon over here. And it's where all the elders are buried. And given that a lot of people aren't traditionally from this place, it's kind of, in an ironic way, the civic place. It's the one place everyone shares and has a culture of ceremony around it. So this was a little school building that came out of the BER, and it was an administration and library component. It started life as an administration building, as a library building, and then as we started, the administration building was burnt down, so we got a second job, which is good. Power of direct architecture, I guess. And I mean, that's the sense of what's going on with this thing. It's a really tough thing. We made the building in the end a matter of economy and efficiency. So the things are concrete construction. It's lined internally with plywood, and it has 3 layers of insulation that manage the climate. I think what the contribution of this thing is that we're trying to locate people not in the town or in the idea of what the school master plan was, but in an idea of what their their cultural landscape was. So when they move in and out of this building, the one thing they know that they have a sense of is where their ancestors and elders are over in the cemetery. And the other simple thing about this is something I learnt in second year at UQ, which was the benefit of 2 sources of light to any space. It's just such a calming thing. This last project is in a place called Tingalpa. Apparently, tingle equals fat and pa equals place. So it was Tingalpa was a place of plentiful food in its day in the local language. It's now a place of plentiful industrial estates and mass housing estates. But I guess, as with all these places, the lowest part of the land, which is where the water is, and the old sort of wetlands, they're still maintained to a degree. And it was just the one thing that was beside the school site that seemed a possibility to connect to. That sort of tortured plan you see there is a library, and it's the setbacks that were given to us by the Brisbane City Council. The school is called the Agnew School, and we're interviewed against 2 other architects, and we won this very, very tight and small competitive interview process, and off we went. And at the end of this, the whole point of this project is just to place, is to get the kids in a setting that tries and softens the imposing industrial nature of everything around it, and the strip clearing residential area, and form this kind of a space. This whole screen faces west, and it's just doing a job of shading. And at the end of that long tortured plan is just one window. It's beside a seated theatre space, and it frames a view of that wetland in the sky. And that's the one idea that ran through that. So you might have recognised a couple of things in those projects which also inform all the other works that we've been doing for the last 6-7 years. And they started by addressing these 4 images, and these 4 images came out of a MPhil I did at the University of Queensland in 2006 with Paul Memmott and Rex Addison, Rui Thompson and Peter Skinner. And these 3 diagrams, after a couple of years, were sort of the main thing. And the first one on the top left is the first space I understood from the islands, and that's the space of settings for people, and it's the ones where you bring people around. And it's in front of an artist's place, and we'd sit around that fire, and you'd sit out in a U shape facing the water, and you'd chat and talk, and that's the first kind of space I realised I understood. The next one is the one on the right, and that's out at Murray Island, and that's where culture, I think, starts to inform your understanding of place. So that those 2 islands there are called Dawa and Waia, and they were spat out as 2 pods out of a dugong ancestor called Gallum after he crossed the ocean. It's a nice story. It was actually made out of 3 volcanic eruptions, but the difference between the symbolic and the scientific is the one I think I've been grappling with for the last 15 years. So now I just see it as a matter of resource in that image, how to manage exactly what's in front of you. The story's a way into understanding the nature of it, but ultimately you have to sustain yourself through it. This third image is probably the third kind of space. It's the last thing I became aware of as an architect, and they're the constructions that you make to articulate your relationship with country and with other people. So it's slightly different to how I was probably taught at UQ, where we started with the building and worked outwards. Some of these things were kind of presumed in other ways. That last diagram is the one, it's my attempt to describe the time-space idea. There's that whole thing about architecture being experienced through either time or through space, and you can do it by time and space or by one over the other. And it's usually shown as either a straight line, start here, finish here, or as one moment. I think the way I've come to understand it, certainly from my mother's heritage up north, is that time only exists if you're in the centre of that section. And if you pass out of time, then you're in the outside of that section, and you end up in the cultural stories and all that sort of symbolic stuff that goes on with it. So the time and space are the one thing. So I'm just going to finish off by just giving you a sense of where the whole project's at right now. So as Lewis intimated before, this book is having a massive effect on the way I've come to look and critique what we took to Venice last year. The week before, we gave a talk down at University of Melbourne, and I asked Michael Markham to come in and critique what we did do in the way that he does. And he really certainly rammed this point home that there's 2 ways to see country: as a symbolic thing or as an economic resource. And if you accept Gamage's position, you have to see it as an economic resource. Fire was used to control planting, find food, manage itself year in, year out in a cyclical process. And when Aboriginal people around Australia stopped doing that, it became overgrown to the point now where he's arguing at the end that, what's he saying, that once Aboriginal people were no longer able to tend their country, it became overgrown and vulnerable to the hugely damaging bushfires we now experience. And what we think of as virgin bush in a national park is nothing of the kind. So about 2 months back, in moving through that book, I got the opportunity to run a 3-day workshop at the University of Sydney with about 180 students in 4th and 5th year. And I was able to articulate the idea of fire a little bit more clearly in relation to country, and also take away the anxiety I think most participants had last year about trying to understand what country was and what being Aboriginal was, because that wasn't the intended consequence. And what they were able to do is, by knowing that they just had to burn city to find country, it took care of that part of the equation, and they can get on with the architectural task of making space by taking away. So it's a purely sculptural sort of concept, I think. But in so doing, they still had to nominate what they'd found, so it wasn't a matter of just willy-nilly cutting out. You had to be clear about what you revealed at the end of it. The second book, which is on that list of 5, is The Possibility of an Absolute Architecture. Now, I've come to this directly through a conversation with Lewis last year. So it's not something I started with, it's something I've ended with, and it's now starting the next reiteration of this whole project. And it's certainly given me a whole other layer of confidence in knowing that the project itself is a substantial project. And based on, I guess, the experience of Venice last year, it's certainly something I should be pursuing. Because 2 years ago I was ready to let it go, because I just couldn't get traction with it in Australia. But, I mean, there's so much in this book, and I just encourage everyone to read it. I'm about to read it for the 3rd time again, so I'm still getting my head around it. But I think the one idea to take away is that he speaks about this thing called the archipelago, and it's the one idea I think I'm getting onto, because he's basically saying it's the idea of separation. Architecture, by its first act, separates and is the thing that also informs you of the politic of that city and of that place. And I think that's what finding country is. From my time, I think, with Donovan Hill and other guys, and also that linkage back to UQ, there was certainly an acceptance of, I guess, that Palladian ideal of the miniature city, and where I've got to now is not a rejection of that, but it's certainly the opposite. And it's found in this Nolli plan, I believe. So there's this Nuova Pianta di Roma, 1748. It's one of 12 sheets at 1:3000 on the left, and it was initiated by Diego Reveles with the blessing of Pope Clement XI to link its territorial statistics and address the city's political and cultural decline. But it represents the radical separation between architectural form and the fabric of the city. And he goes on to say in the book, the Renaissance treatises from Alberti to Palladio postulate that the city could be considered a large house and the house a small city, theorising the equivalence of city form and architectural form. The Nolli map attacked this equivalence for the first time. So in the Nolli drawing, the black indicates the figure of architecture and the ground of the city as a subtle representation of the city. It's not, as it's sometimes misconstrued, a matter of public versus private. Within that drawing, though, it became, and that reading became, I guess, the emphasis for the studio I'm running with final year students at QUT in architecture. And in our instance, black means something totally different. It means the area of the city that's burnt out. So it's the place that returns not to being a park, not to being leftover space. It's a managed piece of the city that's burnt out. And that's the thing we're working towards at the moment, reassembling. So this drawing on the right's an A4 image at 1:10,000 of that part of Tenerife and Newstead, a new farm. And our next iteration will be to blow that up to A2, so we keep doubling up in scale until the form of the city becomes an architectural scale of investigation. In September 2011, QT graciously extended me an opportunity to organise a small lecture series, and I was lucky enough to get hold of this fellow David B. Stewart, who trained at the University of London under Nicholas Pevsner in 1975, and now he's been at the Tokyo Institute of Technology since then. But this book on the left, which I'm only beginning to get through and get my head around, is something he left with me, and I had the benefit, I guess, of a one-on-one tutorial. He made it very clear to me, but one of his heroes is this guy Shinohara, to which he has the part of the archive, and the single idea about Shinohara is that he, according to David, is that he overcame an idea of tradition in symbolism to address modernity and a sense of Japanese space. And I think that's the ambition of what I'm wanting to do with our work, is literally overcome the baggage of Indigenous symbolism and work towards not an Indigenous or Aboriginal space, but just a spatial construct that's of this place, it's original. Also, just finished this year is a project with a collaborator and mentor, Mr. Markham, and this house is for a pair of doctors down at Albury. And he and I thought we'd try this project as an attempt to address this exact issue of what is it to take Fine and Country and turn it into an exercise in modernity. His interests lie in spacecraft and the idea that you tune buildings up, not down. And so he has a very almost offensive level of knowledge into the technical detailing of Apollo 13. And it's in this house, I can guarantee you that. There wasn't much place for me in all of that exercise, but the thing I was interested in was this whole and the idea of what this thing here was. So that's the thing I was working on, what country could be and what it could be about. And what it is about is a word called kapor, which in the Miriam language means origin. And the origin of this place is finding country, and the origin of finding country is a conflict, and it's a conflict between competing interests. And like I said earlier on, the initial form of it was the rejection of the sponsorship model across a model of patronage. So from that, consequences come. But in that courtyard, it takes its form as bush-hammered and polished granite, and it only reveals its entirety in the reflection. So when you walk into this thing, you get a sense of what's the opposite of it. So this is the building. What I can say is that it's incredibly technically proficient in every way. Internally it's concrete precast panels, and it's wrapped in fridge panels externally. Maintains an indoor temperature all year round of approximately 24 to 25 degrees, and has an air exchange system which is, I think it's German engineered. It uses minimal energy to maintain itself and keep running. It's also an essay, I think, in an idea of what architecture could be that deals directly with the essence of country, particularly not as a matter of Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal, but just as an inhabitant of that country there. I mean, I think that house is proof that there really is nothing beyond a bespoke house. This is a pioneer of its own kind. And to be honest, the last time I think I felt both overwhelmed and insignificant in a piece of really good work was Murcutt's Bundanong, the Boyd Foundation building in 1999. I haven't felt like that ever since, and this has done the same thing and probably taken it to another level. So if you'd like to know more about that and where that's going, each night at 6 p.m, there's a website called www.offlinenet.au, and there's an online broadcast of this particular project and another one that he's done that goes for about 10 minutes, and I'd encourage you to see it because it's quite an amazing thing to understand. So on that note, I think I might finish on 7:30. Thank you.
Would you like to have a seat? Sure. And maybe take some questions? Yeah. Please. Yeah, I think there's time for questions, and I encourage the people to do so. Maybe if we can raise the lights a bit. Yeah. There should be 2 microphones, and please wait for the mic to come. Okay, I think there's one question right over there.
Hello. I'm interested to know if you've had any feedback on the first project with the islanders sitting outside and how they've responded to that. Thank you.
Oh yeah, so there are Aboriginal people there. It's worked out really well. That's the feedback. I know because I'm sitting here, because I went there after it was finished for a couple of years on other projects, and you know it's gone well if you're alive, I think. But it manages, it's just a humane intervention, and it's so simple. It's blocks of concrete, and it's clearly a technique I picked up from 3 years working at Donovan Hill. Just a really simple matter of making spaces that you can occupy with minimal effort. So, no, it's working well. The interesting thing is that at the moment we've heard there hasn't been any sort of antisocial behaviour attached to the building, particularly since that artwork went into place, because it was done by one of the elders of that place, who's well respected. Not so the case in Morabinda. That's had other issues because it's just a different place. But the last time we had a story like that was when I was in Marama in the Government Architect's office in Sydney in the 90s, and we did a project at Wilcannia, and we had the same thing. Once we had that buy-in with community, but then also a very senior, well-respected figure contribute artwork in a meaningful way, it also had a social effect. But it's certainly not going to solve long-standing issues.
There's one other question up there.
Particularly with your Mount Cootha house, I was interested with your, like you said, to access the views, then you had to go outside. Like, what was your kind of, like, thought process about territory and why, like particularly from Mount Cootha, where I assume views would be very powerful, why you chose not to make them a part of the house.
I mean, I'd argue they are part of the house. It's just like the house is the entire site, so it's not just the building, I think. So, and I mean, there's two versions of a view. You either make it, you open something into it completely, and it turns into wallpaper after a certain amount of time, or you go to the other end of the spectrum and heighten the experience of it by isolating it, which we've obviously done here to kind of a ridiculous point. But there's a balcony at the front of the house upstairs, which the girls get their hair combed on every morning, and it's the one that you sit out or stand out, as it is, and have that view across to the mountain. But it hasn't worn off in 2 years just yet, because it's something you do when you walk outside. So it's like opening any other cupboard or doorway into something else. But I mean, that's a consequence of a decision, and I think it's all right, isn't it? It's all right. There's no glass in the building, so there's always going to be a hard one.
Any other questions? There's one question here.
Hi, Kev. Thanks. I really enjoyed the talk. Is Finding Country going to end up being a lifelong project, do you think? Because I'm interested in how it's gone from a project that was about a particular idea and now it's becoming a project that we can see in particular architectural projects and teaching work and all sorts of things. So are you imagining that this is going to be an exploration that you'll continue, or are you going to move on, do you think?
Oh, I better ask Susan, I think. Is that all right? I mean, I think I'd like, obviously, it's got a trajectory attached to it, and each conversation that happens each year is just changing it. So where it was in 2005, I mean, it started on a balcony in the Donovan Hill office, and over a few beers with Michael Markham, and then it's gone in different places and collected its detractors and supporters, and I mean, that's probably the sign that it's doing something. But yeah, I'm going to see whether this master studio takes it now, because that's kind of the next form of it. And obviously the next idea is to take it out of 2 dimensions and into 3. Because I mean, I was in a really quiet way, really pleased with myself when we got to Venice, and Dave and I finished this thing and had a few drinks to celebrate. But then when I got around and saw what Eisenman, I mean, he won the Golden Lion there in 2004, and what these guys have done, it just, again, it sort of made me feel a little bit undergraduate in what I was trying to do. But, that was a birth of fire last year, I think, it's fair to say.
I think there was another question down here.
I was just interested in the hairbrushing on the balcony. Like, in terms of your house, how much did you design to the experiences you were already living, like spaces for them to happen, and how much did you let the space sort of be the platform for new experiences to form?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I just know that Susan and I had a lot of pseudo arguments, and in a good way, and it kind of, I don't know, it just sort of happened, didn't it? And I mean, I was holding a pencil, but Susan was looking at it a lot, so we'd have a discussion and it'd go away and come back. And then, I mean, Lachlan Nielsen sat very quietly in the corner and tried to not get too caught up in those discussions, but helped when we got onto that DD stage, like with just the detailing and the systems, all the sliding panels and the use of the polycarbonate. But I mean, they were just unexpected things. It sort of, I think I just about drove you nuts, didn't I? So it was, I think it's like any design process, you're not quite sure where it's going to end up, and this other thing fell out of it. Probably the only thing that was really difficult was designing what ended up becoming the kitchen, or non-kitchen, because it's just a table with some joinery wrapped around it. So, and it's laid out, as it worked out, directly on the diagram of Susan's family's house in the country back in Ireland. So like right down to where the fridge is and where the last sink is. It's just the same diagram, so that was a good one to crack.
I think I find that a lot, that people replicate kitchens from their childhoods. It happens a lot. People draw it for us.
Well, just to clarify, I did the kitchen.
So who cooks?
Susan. No, but it was one because there's, you either end up with the typical apartment set out where it's like galley kitchen, Italian appliances, fancy dining chairs, all that sort of stuff, and which we weren't really into. So we had this picture on our computer in the room, and it's a picture of this Aga in Susan's family's house, and we'd been arguing around this for quite a lot of time, and then we were just looking at this picture, and the penny dropped, and I didn't tell Susan for another day or two. And once we got to it, it was a natural thing, and it just fell into place. But the point of it was that it made the act of eating became the social event that it should be, which is what I think country kitchens embody. So that's the thing we do with friends and family. I think it works really well.
Okay. Is there any other? I think there's another question up here.
Hey Kevin, how you going?
Good.
I remember speaking to you at the start of the semester, and I asked you what I would get in the Masters, just for everyone that's in here tonight, what I'd get out of the semester, and you said that one of the things that occurs in every job is that you remove before you start a process. And we've been dealing a lot with removal so far in the Masters studio. And I was just looking at the project behind you and thought, in terms of a country project, what was removed from the site in this context as opposed to an urban context?
Yep. Yeah, they're different, but it's just the foundations, effectively. And there's a cellar in the bottom of that thing which has a lot of expensive wine. But it's the first thing. The minute you take away, in the way that O'Reilly describes it, you're separating something from somewhere. We've taken away a bit of ground. And that's not going to change, I think, with any building. So.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question here.
Hi, Kevin. I was really taken by surprise by this last building, because all the other buildings, they are inside of an urban context, and you try to relate to the country. And this building, it feels like you deny completely the country. There are pretty much, I can't see the other facades, but there are pretty much no windows. And the only inner garden, it's a completely dry garden. So how is this building related to the country?
That thing, you'll have to log on to that website to see it in due course, but that's one image. It's a concrete tent. That's the only side that's hard. That triangular window behind me is right beside a fireplace that you can literally put a sleeping bag next to, and when you're beside that fire, the triangular window just frames this view of the sky. So you're literally inside in sub-zero temperatures, which Albury can have, in complete comfort, seeing the stars. The back side of the house to the left is it's reasonably open, and the other side is a mesh screen, which is its circulation, so it's incredibly transparent actually. But I'm under instruction not to show it.
Okay. Well, I think before I thank Kevin, I'd like to remind everyone that next week the speaker will be Bijoy Jain from Studio Mumbai, and that the drinks or gathering will happen downstairs during the opening of the exhibition of the regional awards. So you're all welcome to come, and now please join me thanking Kevin.